is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. That's right. This is the number one theological source of ideological goodness on the interwebs since the year 2008. I've been bringing you interviews with theologians, philosophers, biblical scholars, extraordinary thinkers. And today on the podcast, we have a return visit. A return visit from the one and only John Thatamanil. That's right. He is professor of theology and world religions at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And he is the author of a new book, Circling the Elephant, a comparative theology of religious diversity. And I love talking to John. This conversation is so much fun. He not only wants to challenge us to think about the nature of religious diversity, but wants us to think theologically in that diversity. In what ways does religious diversity change the way we think as theologians? We had so much fun in this conversation, and I can't wait for you to hear it. Now, before we hop in, I want to let you all know that we're doing some exciting things for the Homebrewed Christianity community. That's right. The people that went to homebrewedcommunity.com and signed up, they donate each month to make this possible for the thousands and thousands of people out there. Yes, those people. But we are starting a series of introductions to different philosophers and thinkers that are just for members. We're going to be talking about Deleuze. We're going to be talking about Levinas. We're going to be talking about Ricoeur. People like that. And these special sessions just for our Homebrewed community members. You'll get a introductory lecture, and then we'll have a short reading, a chapter or an article by the thinker for you to dig in and read, and then engage in a conversation with other members. Each of these sessions will take place live, obviously, but also available in perpetuity on the Homebrewed community podcast feed. That is the members-only podcast feed where you get access to over 150 extra episodes, a constantly growing library of lectures from online classes to lectures I do on my current research project and stuff like that, to live events and all sorts of exciting things. Well, if you want to be a part of this, go to homebrewedcommunity.com. Yeah, and you can be cool like some of our new members. Lindsay C. Boom shakalaka. Shout out, Lindsay. And Alexandria B. Alexandria B. Thank you for joining the Homebrewed community. James M. What's up, James? Adina C. Oh, hi. Thank you all for becoming new members of the Homebrewed community. You too can be cool like them. Anyway, very excited that John Thatamanil is back on the podcast, and I hope you enjoy it half as much as I did, because then you'll say to yourself, oh, I love John Thatamanil. What was that book? I gotta go get it. Oh, Circling the Elephant. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is John Thatamanil, because last time he was in the middle of working on a new book, and that book is out. It's called Circling the Elephant, a comparative theology of religious diversity. And, with all the anticipation you built a couple of years ago, I think it paid off. And are you feeling good about it now that it exists and you're hearing from people?
Yeah, I am feeling good about it. You write something and you don't know exactly whether it amounts to anything, and then you leave it be and allow the book to collect a bit of dust, and then you go back and look at it and you're like, hey, who was the guy who wrote that book? That's not too shabby, So I'm mostly having a positive reaction to the book.
That's good, because I'm biased in that I like you, which I think does affect how I read a book. But I really enjoyed it, and the way you even begin the book itself is in the preface are your own experiences, both when you were studying abroad, your work when you were at Vanderbilt, and then coming into your time in New York at Union. So maybe you could introduce how the conceptual framework of the book itself and the thinking through of what it means to do to comparative thinking theologically and stuff really comes from your own questions that are occasioned by a historical situation.
You know, that was the scariest part of the book. We academics are really not encouraged by and large to write in an autobiographical vein, let alone about our own religious inclinations and experiences. And I really was scared about writing it. And maybe scared sounds dramatic, but some people said, oh, no, John, just don't do it. And others, verboten, don't go there, don't go there. And others were like, well, you know, that might work. So I'm glad you found that interesting and useful. I mean, fundamentally, I think of myself in some ways as a theologian who writes out of his experience as an immigrant, but a weird one. I came to the US when I was almost 9, and I'm keenly aware that if I'd come just 3 years later, everything would have been different. The only language in which I can currently think well in is English. I read other languages, but that's different from thinking well. And my mother tongue is really for household purposes. So I don't have to translate out of Malayalam. I know what I'm thinking there, and I can think without thinking about thinking, if you know what I mean. But when I arrived here, the question of what it meant to be Indian took on a particular urgency. And as early as high school, I was introduced to a book then called The Religions of Man by Houston Smith. And that was for me not just an academic exercise. It was actually in Sunday school that an uncle of mine introduced me to that book. And it provided a window into this whole question of what it meant to be Indian. You know, other than, you know, you can't date, you have to have an arranged marriage. Here are the normative expectations for your life. We'll give you really good Indian food, but, you know, the rest of your life will be constrained by these norms, right? So to be able to say, oh my God, there are these vast religious riches that are also part of your inheritance. That was really probably the thing that launched me into eventually becoming a comparative theologian. I sometimes wonder if I would have done any of this if my family had just stayed in India. So it's interesting. Dislocation led to this longing.
Well, and I think in one sense that, I mean, you know, like Tillich's move across the ocean in the context of World War II is moving across disciplines. So he had that the being a theologian or philosopher of the boundary, right? And I think that your own biographical the way your own biography shapes what you're doing, it gives that type of tension that demands a type of creativity. That your own felt relationship to these different worlds or mythopoetic structures and rituals and things, you have to show up for them, and you have to do so within traditions that are still figuring out what it's like to show up to each other. Right? And so in a sense, your own personal experience and the experience like you share of in the same space, in the same day, having the Eucharist and then practicing contemplation together and stuff, like there are places where humans are already embodying a type of multi-religious identity where mutual transformation is taking place and things. And so the creative work and kind of philosophical work that underneath what you're doing, I see is a type of multi-religious evangelism, right? Like you're giving this, like the structure to affirm this real lived reality, you and the people that you're trying to articulate their lived experience in with a conceptual framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, the communities that I am a part of are not, I mean, they are in a sense of making it up as they go, but not in a kind of shallow ad hoc way. These are people who are trying to be deeply Christian and deeply Buddhist. And that requires reflection. And you're right, there is a sense in which I'm watching the lived experience and struggles of friends and community members, and trying to articulate what might this all mean. And as you say, the word mutual transformation, something that we both love from our Kabian intersections, is a good one to sort of talk about what might be happening. And in some way, as I say in the book, all I'm trying to do is to say our traditions became the kinds of creative resources they are through mutual encounter. Don't stop that process, right? There's no reason the tradition constitution needs to somehow freeze itself when its own fecundity emerged precisely through interreligious encounters. Mm-hmm. Why would we want to stop that and freeze that? We can't at any rate. We might as well just be intentional about it.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you could expand on this a bit, because I think one of the freeing insights, especially for people whose own biography doesn't put them in multiple religious traditions, it's precisely in recognizing that traditions are always traditioning, and that these encounters across difference are already constitutive of that identity, that really frees one up.
Yeah, I mean, the last chapter begins with Gregory trying to articulate, Gregory of Nyssa, trying to do his Trinitarian reflection and do comparative theology at the same time. Now, he wouldn't have called it comparative theology. For the dude, it was just theology. To think theologically was to say that Christians are, by being Trinitarian, on the one hand saying yes to Jews with respect to the unity of the divine life. It is one. So we agree with the Jews there, but we disagree with them because we want to say there is a multiplicity in divinity. And in this respect, we're moving closer to pagan interlocutors, but we disagree with them with respect to multiplicity without unity. So we're the perfect middle, right? So here he is defending and creating in theological form the very doctrine of Trinity, which is arguably definitive of who we are, but he does it in comparative perspective. And that's illuminating for me, right? It should be illuminating for all of us to see a theologian who in no way separates comparative theology from what we would today call constructive theology or systematic theology. So in some ways, the comparative theologian is not doing anything new. We're continuing a kind of work in which self-constitution and dialogue are inextricable. Mm-hmm. Those two are part of the very work of what it means to make sense of our own discourse. Mm-hmm. It's as though we know what we want to say and what we mean to say precisely when we say it otherwise, in relation to communities of conversation. Otherwise, we don't quite even know what we're saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And the, underneath that type of dialogue is a presumption about the nature of religious conversation. One where even someone like Gregory, who, if you asked him to, could give an apologetic account of the Christian religion, but it's not the type we have after modernity. And I think that that shapes the popular religious imagination, where you imagine a tradition as something settled. It is a list of propositions that you can articulate clearly, and then the goal is to harness facts and some parts of contingent existence lineups to a collection of reference that now justifies your religious explanation. And then the whole discussion of what religious truth is in the modern world works against having a account of religion that recognizes this generative multiplicity that you're getting at. And so I wonder, like, as you're working through this, if there are particular ideas or phrases or concepts that you see, you know, in popular religious and spiritual conversations that you want to nip in the bud, because you're like, what's going on in these places that just doesn't actually open up spaces.
Well, you know, the pet peeve, maybe the pet peeve for the book, is the notion of religious worlds. The idea that we, each of us, inhabit hermetically sealed, and I'm thinking of Trump's limo now, like hermetically sealed from outside influences. This world discourse, I know why we use it. I know that the resources of every religious tradition tries to interpret the world and even constitute the world in some respects. But when this world discourse leads us to imagine that our traditions are sealed off or walled off from each other, that they have these deep transhistorical grammars that don't change, surface details may change, but there's a pristine Christian narrative structure. All of this sounds to me like, either a clash of civilizations rhetorics or, build a wall rhetoric. So there's an imaginative trap that's lingering in that discourse. And as I show in the book, when you construct religions in this way, you do so precisely because a reified entity can be compared with other reified entities and rank ordered, right? Yeah. And I saw a show that some of the same people who talked about modern race theory and invented modern race theory were influential in constructing our conceptions of reified religions, and both for the same purposes, to rank order human communities. But if they're porous, if they flow in and out of each other, if they're constituting and constituted by each other, then you can't rank order them.
Right.
That's most inconvenient.
Yeah. Well, and there's if people are listening and that's a new thought, just like search on Homebrewed modern and race, and there's a whole episode about it and the role Kant and everybody and Schleiermacher and all play in developing. And one of the things that strikes me, or a part of it that you emphasize in the book, is that it's like underneath that logic of where rarefying religions and then locating them and assessing them, that's the same time where religion historically becomes subservient to the type of power of nation states, right? So like at the turn of the Enlightenment, you have this shift where, because of the wars of religion and because of the multiplicity in Europe of different expressions of Christianity, you're now trying to figure out a category of religion that enables public cooperation without the domination of a particular religious system. And so you get, in a sense, the nation state comes to be more powerful than religion and public discourse, and then religion gets harnessed in a whole new way for colonialism. And what do you need in that type of category where now religion is the justificatory logic of domination? Is you need zero-sum thinking. That's what you need. So we can order races, we can order religions, we can do all these things, and now we're just treating the world as we interpret it as if it's natural, right? And so religion becomes naturalized, or in the hierarchy of religions, it's just how it is. And I think that mythology is so problematic But that zero-sum thinking in religion has lingered and has such ugly consequences. One of the elements of what you do that struck me is how it's not just it's wrong and impoverished. It's that we as religious practitioners are leaving behind a wealth of resources and a wealth of possibilities if we keep that zero-sum logic operating.
Yeah, and you know, so much of what I do in the book is as a plea for receptivity.
Mm-hmm.
That we have so much yet to learn from our neighbors of other faiths, and I speak of a hospitality of receiving. I'm influenced, though I don't think he quite uses that term, by Amos Yong. And more directly by Mahatma Gandhi, who routinely pleads with missionaries and says to them, you know, you come to India to give, but we miss the spirit of humility, of the willingness to receive. And Gandhi makes clear that if you try to give, but from a posture where you have nothing to receive, the hand remains a fist. It's a closed fist, you know. I mean, again, that's my metaphor, but it's there implicit in what he's saying. So, you know, these walled off religious traditions can't be dynamic, can't be receptive, and can't learn and grow and be transformed. And you're quite right. You know, it's the zero-sum logic embedded in such ways of thinking can easily become handmaidens for colonial projects, for imperial projects, right? I mean, I know you better than you know yourself. My religion's categories are more adequate to divinity and therefore also more adequate to being able to understand what is really going on in your tradition. And one hears this discourse, you know, I'm thinking in particular of certain kinds of radical orthodoxy, where you explicitly hear that the Christian categories know better what's actually going on in another tradition than that tradition knows about itself. I mean, you know, you can see just how easily that kind of patronizing disposition is completely handy for imperial projects.
Yeah. Also, like, it's amazing if you operate there, just how many things you can blame Duns Scotus for. I mean, that's the other part. You know, one of the things about choosing the image of the elephant is just how many different ways people have used it. And I remember being in, you know, some youth thing when I was growing up, where, you know, it was used as an explanation essentially to set up how Christians, like, obviously, you know what an elephant is because, you know, I once was blind, but now I see, kind of thing. You know, like the whole premise of the story gets end up using that. Well, now that you've been washed in the blood, you could obviously see it was an elephant and walk around the whole thing. Like, one, why did you end up going with a story or a story to center it that has such a long history? And then how do you take it differently than kind of is anticipated?
Yeah, I suspect that there's an impulse in my writing to have central tropes and categories come from traditions other than my own. So in the first book, the way I talked about the human predicament borrows from the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. And so here too, the central figure or trope for the book comes from Indic traditions. I want to think with other resources than the ones that I'm accustomed to. And this one has been so fecund, right? It's been used by Jains and Buddhists, and then it's become a kind of cultural trope. But as I show in the book, it has been roundly panned by evangelical leaning figures of all sorts, perhaps most prominently by Leslie Newbigin, who just thinks it's horrible. So, you know, part of my mischief-making propensity is to say, is it really as bad as you say it is? and surely we need more metaphors to think with than mountain climbing, right? So, I mean, one reason is I'm tired of climbing those damn mountains. uh, you know, this field of theology of religious diversity is just captivated by that one metaphor. That we're just various paths climbing the same mountain, or with Markheim, improvement, we're climbing many mountains. And the only other metaphor I'm aware of that's commonly used in the literature is John Hick's Copernican metaphor of planets, you know, orbiting around the same sun, rather than you know, a geocentric Ptolemaic orientation. So that, you know, that's about it. Those two metaphors have the lock on us. And partly what I'm doing is saying enough, right? What if we have a metaphor that allows us both to affirm something like a unity and a multiplicity? The trouble with the many mountains approach or metaphor is that it does fragment into discourse of multiple ultimate realities, which doesn't make much sense to me. I mean, how many ultimates can you have?
Well, I have a friend that wrote
I know.
about 9 of them.
Oh, 9. Oh my God.
Yeah. Can you handle that?
Oh boy, they keep going. They keep going.
Yeah. You need, well, I mean, you gotta contribute something in your dissertation, John. So
yeah, indeed.
If you go to the right place, you can find a new ultimate.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not unsympathetic, but it seems to me conceptually challenging. The elephant image allows you to recognize that there really is a multiplicity and a unity at once, right? There's so much to learn about this elephant. And of course, as I say towards the end of the book, if the elephant is in fact infinite, there is actually no circling it. So there's a way in which I subvert the metaphor at the heart of the book as well, because really there is no way of circling the entire elephant. Anyway, those are some of the reasons why I think it's a good metaphor to think with. And as you know, I also include a disability angle where I actually think it's a virtue that the blindfolded, or in the original story, the blind persons, must move carefully over the surfaces of things in incremental ways. Whereas the visual metaphors, you know, I learned this from John Hull, a blind theologian. The visual metaphors give you the impression that you can take in the whole synoptically. Whereas if you're either blind or blindfolded, you don't make that false assumption that you can see the whole. You do touch and work patiently over the surfaces of things, and then build gradually a knowledge of the whole. So those are some of the reasons why I wanted to play with this image in really new ways.
And I mean, I really liked it. And when I was thinking about it, I was trying to think of other images that, you know, that were similar to it, that also get at things you do in the book. And the one that kept lingering is, you know, in Meister Eckhart, he gives this image of God as the great underground river that no one can dam up, right? And so the ultimate reality essentially is water. And there's so many different ways you encounter water, right? Like muddy streams or oceans, all that kind of stuff. You're actually made of more water than you're made of anything else, and you can't even live without water. So then, but that particular image like had this similar thing where it decenters that type of conversation. That, I mean, I think the mountain image, when you draw it on a board, does more harm to religions than anything, because you've never actually been to a mountain you can see the whole thing of. But in a classroom, you draw a mountain, and if you're lucky, they put a cloud of mysticism on the top, because why not? That's how they hang out up there. And then you can see everyone's trajectory, right? And like that activity puts you, the person watching the educator explain to you how multiple religious traditions work, in this God's eye perspective. It makes perfect sense if you're thinking in the West and your theological reflection is so shaped by colonial missiology that then you're trying to give a map. Because what do we do with maps? We put everyone on the terrain and then we figure out how we can come to control it, right? Yeah. And I just feel like there's so much like type of violence to the other when we divide things up that way, that we do need new metaphors. And in the fact that you explore it and choose it from another religious tradition, and it's one that we already know Christians screw up, right? Like, it's not like you pick some passage that I'm like, oh, that's in a Veda. No, like you can find Billy Graham giving stupid sermons about, oh, well, Jesus washed my eyes and now I can see and I don't need to be bumbling around like a blind. Like, I remember hearing those things and the problem that I think you addressed head on is that it's in one sense, it is a love letter to people of faith to trust their deep intuitions that they encounter when they encounter what they label like the religious other. And then that same dynamic or kind of sacred erotic energy that's there is something you're going like, that's how the universe is. It's alive in this deep way. And so that unbinding of religion that you do in it is really a gift to our full humanity if you attend to it.
Oh, thank you. What a treat to be heard so deeply and so well. I'm a little verklempt, as they used to say on Saturday Night Live. Talk amongst yourselves. No, I think that's exactly right. There is throughout this book a kind of longing for what the other can teach me that I don't already know. And even a feeling that the things that I take myself to securely possess, Trinity, right? I might actually understand that notion better by giving it away, that by practicing a kind of theological vulnerability with what I think is mine, I might actually receive it back again enriched. Mm-hmm. And so that is a kind of erotic exchange. And I think I've been tutored by this by a variety of thinkers, including an Indian thinker from my own tradition, M.M. Thomas, who wrote a beautiful book called Risking Christ for Christ's Sake. The title itself captures me, Risking Christ for Christ's Sake.
Yeah, if you thought of that, you'd have to write the book, right? Like,
yes, that's right.
If I thought of it, I would go see, can I buy the URL? And if I did, I'd buy it. And then I would say, well, I got to have to do it.
Yeah, and what he did was to show how Indian thinking about Christ is transformed by all the different sort of Hindu voices that rethought Jesus afresh, including, for example, Gandhi's reading of Jesus as Satyagrahi, as the nonviolent resistor, right? That's a new Christology. Mm-hmm. And Christians receive that in profound ways and have been transformed by having given Jesus away and received Jesus back again in ways we never knew him, right? That kind of imaginative disposition of giving and receiving and being transformed in that process is what is a deep drive of the book. By the way, just in a less elevated sense, the elephant metaphor also allowed me to make a conceptual point, which is central to the book. And it's useful just to say that the book is trying to say we have to integrate three things. Why do we have so many different accounts of the elephant? Mm-hmm. That's theology of religious diversity. Might we actually walk over to some other side of the elephant? That's comparative theology. And might we attempt to redescribe the elephant? That's constructive theology. The metaphor allows me to say, what if we try to combine these three tasks? Mm-hmm. And so there's a kind of usefulness that's sort of conceptually handy. And that's another reason for centering that image.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of the pushback from theologians not invested in comparative theology, there's a number of places, and I'm interested in kind of how you would engage it. And one is the concept of revelation. So, so much of modern theology is based on how you respond to kind of Karl Barth's insistence on special revelation. And then even though how the Trinity plays out is so shaped by Karl Rahner that like both the question of the Trinity and Revelation you deal with so differently than those two in the book, but yet in ways that are so distinctively Christian yet open to the religious other. That like I feel like it'd be helpful for you to contrast what you're doing with those kind of more popular, I don't know, monologics of sort.
Yeah, I mean, I think this may be where Tillich does some of the work implicitly for me, and what he would call the Protestant principle, right? He never denies a strong doctrine of revelation. He would only insist that we're always muddled up in the reception of that revelation. There's no pristine reception, and so there's always a reason to be cautious about what we take revelation as having disclosed to us. The idea that revelation somehow so overwhelms us as to create any absolutes of any kind that might be taken in any sense to be infallible is something he refuses on the basis of what he calls the Protestant principle. And I guess that's I don't probably use that word ever in the book. I'm you can go onto Kindle and Google Protestant principle, and it's probably not there. But I suspect something like that is implicit in a kind of let's not absolutize. But more, what is more likely operative in an explicit way is the apophatic principle. That what is revealed nonetheless remains always excessive. It's always more. And so revelation is never a kind of, here is given into your hands, into your sovereign and controlling hands, the whole of the divine mystery. My God, that's dangerous stuff, right? A revelation that you can control. And Barth would agree with this, is no revelation. A revelation whose light is so blinding that it darkens all other access to light anywhere else. It's probably not revelation. I'm really wary. So there's a sense in which, through Tillich and the apophatic tradition as a whole, revelation discloses to you that what is being revealed remains always more, always beyond your control. And as I suspect, Barth would agree with that.
I mean, the contrast of Barth and Tillich is pretty significant in certain places. And which Barth you get to contrast him with is always different. Found out that in Europe, he's a little more open than he is in New Jersey. But one of the things that I thought was there, like when you mentioned Tillich, in a number of his philosophy of religion essays, when Tillich's explaining the relationship of the unconditioned to the conditioned, and how that is an ontological statement is true about all conditioned existence, then like in your book, when you talk about unbinding and you talk about like the bewildering possibility of all life to kind of transfix and move and animate the person religiously. I mean, I see that in Tillich, because he's just like, Tillich's observation is like, that's just what is possible with any conditioned thing. Like anything can become the place in which
Yes.
the event of God comes. So it's just really dumb to cut your legs out from under you theologically and then say, because God has mediated an encounter with me by Jesus, therefore I'm just going to hit the mute button on everything else. And Tillich wants to go, no, as a Christian, the Christ event or new being, right, like is normative in the sense of revealing to me the revelatory structure of existence in some type of way. But are you telling me that the ground of being can't take up whatever the hell it feels like? Like,
Yeah.
in this sense, like it all teems with this bewildering possibility. And I find that we need to figure out, I think, as theologians and in a pluralist context, how to full-throatedly tell everyone just how impotent their theology is. If you just really think God can't take up anything, and create these type of events that disrupt all your assumptions and give you yourself back in new ways. That's called, less Christian is funny. That's the
Yeah.
thing I don't get. And it's like, have you read the beginning of Colossians?
Yeah, and also, I mean, if I might quote Herr Bart, if God can speak through a dead dog, why can't He speak to us through Hinduism?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a problem. There's a problem right there. So yes, a full amen to you on that front. Yeah.
Well, even the way you put that. So I'm wondering, as someone who, I too am fascinated about the ways you can connect, like process thought and Tillich and stuff. And when you think of, when you say like, oh, why couldn't God speak to us through the Hindu traditions? How would you describe, as a philosophical theologian, the activity of God speaking in these historic traditions, prior to the type of multiplicity of engagements now? Like when you look at the way they engage difference in their own tradition, but it's like now, like someone just turned on a faucet and all this wisdoms that we're cultivating in different places are crisscrossing in this new intensity, right? So like, when you think of how God relates to the world moment to moment, what is getting itself done in any one tradition for you as a philosophical theologian, that then if you cut yourself off from it, like, are you cutting yourself off from the actual fruit of God's relationship with this tradition? Or how would you imagine that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, um, this is such an exciting question that I'm aware of the many, many ways I might go.
We can do more than one if you want.
Yeah, but the book builds towards a kind of strange use of the Vestigio Trinitatis tradition by
For non-Latin speakers, the vestige of the Trinity was it was a way of talking about the presence of that which is God's self-testimony in a multiplicity of places.
Right. The if you will, the fingerprint of a Trinitarian God will be reflected in the Trinitarian structure of existence, and articulated by Augustine. But I do it in my own way, but as infused and informed by other religious traditions. So, I mean, I think of religious traditions as attempts to gain what I call comprehensive qualitative orientation. Traditions are attempting to read reality faithfully and to be conformed to reality rightly through therapeutic regimes by which we configure and comport ourselves to reality as truly read. So, there are these millennia-long projects of trying to read experience faithfully, and in which it's not just the human trying to read experience, but experience and reality speaking back to these traditions. So I think of traditions as these vast repertoires of accumulated wisdom, practice wisdom, and conceptual wisdom. And for us to cut ourselves off from processes of inquiry that have been going on cumulatively over millennia is a radical arrogance, an absolute lack of humility that's unjustifiable. So if human beings in these traditions have been trying to read experience faithfully and finding wondrous resources, and wonder is a central category in the book, then we ought to go and look and learn. At least that's a way of starting the process. And I talk about at least 3 kinds of wonder that are central in a variety of traditions. The wonder that there is anything at all, the sheer fact of being, the wonder around singularity, that anything that is so absurdly particular and distinctive. Duns Scotus would agree. He would call that hakeity. I mean, you know, if I were close and the picture was better, I could see the difference between your left eyebrow and your right. You know, for me, this is wondrous, right? That's there's something in reality that generates this kind of absurd profusion of singularity. And that's wondrous. And but no such singularity is what it is apart from being in relation, right? So there is the wonder that everything that is what it is in relation. So my theology is rooted in the fact that these 3 kinds of wonder point to features in reality that I might call Trinitarian, and that in this sense bear a mark of a Trinitarian divine. But what I do is I show that the different strands of our traditions groove on these particular kinds of wonder. You know, Madhyamaka Buddhists, you know, they are captured by the wonder of relation. Ground of being traditions are astonished by the sheer fact that there is something rather than nothing. And traditions that want to emphasize singularity typically tend to go in either a theistic tradition or just hallowing what a Zen person might call suchness, the very particular suchness of each thing as it is. So, so this is some of the direction I go, right? Is it possible that certain traditions, by having practiced rigorously to attend to, say, for example, relatedness, and having tutored bodies for millennia on how bodies might see that to be is to be in relation. Right, I'm thinking of Thich Nhat Hanh right now, who is apparently just over the last few days stopped eating and is entering the final phase of his transition to parinirvana, perhaps, or coming back again to join us. But anyway, his notion of interbeing, we aren't just here alone. We are inter-are, to use his language, or we interbe, right? His tradition has attuned itself exquisitely to this mystery. And we who want to celebrate relation would be foolish if we didn't enter into relation with a tradition that has attuned itself so richly to the truth of relation. So that's the kind of work this book invites us, you know, to do.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that, or one of the ways I've tried describing it, especially in pastoral context, is, you know, there are 2 different ways you meet your new family after you get married. Like, and one of them is just going to be bitter. They're not like your family, right? Like, where it's precisely that their difference is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
and then it shows up in your marriage because like you aren't just like, and another is like, I actually don't know these people yet. And my only encounter was this one person that I met that used to be a stranger to me, I deeply love. And whatever led up to my partner, these people were a part of it, and I want to go figure it out. Right. And I think that like how you frame what their mystery of the other means is so important. Like when a religious tradition, especially Christianity, thinks that like the most Christian thing about you or how you pass true false tests on theology quizzes, and like what are you assenting to, or can you keep your language game nice and Christian, and these type of things, then the affirmation of your fidelity is so cognitively centered.
Yes.
that you're like the person who shows up the first time you're at your partner's Christmas gathering and they open presents on Christmas Eve and you're just dumbfounded. You're like, we do not open on Christmas Eve. It's not Jesus' birthday yet. And they're like, yeah, well, tomorrow we're going to go to the aunt. One group goes to the aunt, so we do it on Christmas Eve. You're like, no, this is ridiculous. But like under other ways, you show up and there's this giant mystery. You've had this one encounter. It opens you up with your neighbor. And then you go like, what wisdom are you carrying? What stories are here? And then you meet these people you've never met, but you trust them because you met a neighbor. And then this person you fell in love with. And now like, so like how we kind of in a sense pre-validate the mystery of the other as something sacred is really important. And when the cognitive or descriptive differences are things that require sameness or capitulation, or like we used earlier, the image of the fist, right? Like when truth comes in a fist, you can either ask them to hold it long enough that their fingers look like yours, right? Like that they've held the truth and now it shapes, they follow the shape, or you punch them. And and that open-handed thing is a promise to show up to the mystery and the difference. But you're showing up with your hands, right? Like you haven't denied yourself.
No, absolutely. I think I say it somewhere in here, but certainly it's become a kind of mantra for me. There is no way of moving towards the mystery of God without moving towards the mystery of the neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
I just want people to hear that. There's no way to move towards the mystery of God without moving towards the mystery of the neighbor. If you want to talk about a deep logic of Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
I'm allergic to such discourse because it suggests too much stability. But if you wanted to say something about a deep logic, that would be it. You cannot find God without finding your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true, then why the heck do you imagine that it would be possible to love your neighbor while discarding or demeaning everything that your neighbor holds dear?
Mm-hmm.
I don't get it. What love says to the neighbor, your faith is so small, right? I preached a sermon this past Sunday in which Jesus says to the Canaanite woman, how great is your faith? And when he says that, he is transformed, right? And undergoes a kind of reconfiguration of his own sense of ministry.
Mm-hmm.
I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. Well, that falls apart because he says, how great is your faith?
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, all I'm asking my Christian neighbors to do is to be like Jesus. Go and put yourself before people whose manner of living and whose wisdom leads you to say, my God, how great is your faith? And see what happens to you.
Mm-hmm.
You won't be the same. Really, that's my gospel.
Well, I mean, the connection between honoring the mystery of God and your neighbor isn't too different from loving God and loving your neighbor, or maybe not bearing false witness against your neighbor and not worshiping idols. They're very similar activities that
Absolutely. If you think you know your neighbor or even your partner, you're done for. Because the minute that's the moment that you erase the mystery. And when the mystery is erased, the eros ends.
It is dumbfounding sometimes how people are more confident about how God is in God's self than they are about the person they've given themselves to in their life. Like I'm just sitting there going, I don't even know if I know myself that well, and yeah, which was why I mentioned Rahner's rule earlier. I'm always like, really, is that necessary? Maybe my second half of life I'll have confidence enough to speak about the immanent Trinity. I'm not optimistic, John. Not optimistic here. Still working on becoming a Christian.
And that's why I say that, if you look at the tradition, the Trinity never gets bottled up. Mm-hmm. It never gets bottled up. It's not as though we've ever said, okay, now we understand the Trinity. I mean, my goodness, the fathers say we don't even know what the number 3 means. I mean, how are you going to say you know the Trinity if at the core of the doctrine of the Trinity is an argument that numbers cannot mean for the infinite what they mean for quantifiable entities in a finite world, right? So the church fathers are stealing the number 3 from us, even as they posit it. So they affirm it and take it away. So if Trinity is that mysterious, it never becomes a way of locking down our knowledge of divinity. If anything, it's explosive. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is to leave it explosive and say, well, what if we come at the Trinity with fresh eyes instead of avoiding it like the plague on Trinity Sunday and hiring somebody else to be the guest preacher? Like, I'm not touching that.
You just let the youth minister do it. You're like, you want Trinity Sunday?
That's right.
When I worked at the UCC church when I was in California, and they would give me Trinity Sunday because they were like, you're probably the only one here that doesn't cross both hands if they talk about it, so we'll just let you do it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I always just said y'all should read more Joseph Bracken. When I read Bracken's what's the black book with the where he uses where creativity becomes the Godhead in Whitehead.
No,
and deals with religious pluralism. I read it at the end of divinity school and was just like, yeah, I like this. Now and then I would just pretend that that's always what everyone always meant by the Trinity at churches. I would just like repeat Joseph Bracken. They're like, that's what that's talking about. I'm like, yeah, I learned it from a Jesuit.
Yeah, like, how can you argue?
He's Jesuit, Father Joe. When you think of your current task of like handing the Christian tradition on to ministers, activists, people that are now, you go to divinity school or seminary, you aren't like thoroughly grounded in your tradition. Yeah. A lot of times you're going and discovering what's going on in your own religion, let alone others, right? So how does introducing, in a sense, people considering vocational commitments of faith and their kind of lack of, I don't know, biblical literacy and the linguistic shaping of the tradition, how does your comparative work change the way you introduce people to their own tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that remains a constant struggle and work of experimentation for me, and I suspect for many, many faculty, not least because course design is so fundamentally caught up in all of this, right? What gets taught in which course? Certain kinds of disciplinary constraints. Well, now you're teaching comparative theology class. Now you're teaching the ST 103 class, systematic theology intro, right? So the very fact that some of these classes are kept separate can interfere with this project. But some of the ways I I try to disrupt that logic beyond just mushing stuff together that typically is bifurcated into different courses, is by reminding my students that from the beginning, theology and prayer were never bifurcated, right? So on day one of any time I teach SD 103, which is our sort of Union's basic course, or was one of its basic courses, I cite Evagrius, right? Evagrius says, the theologian is the one who prays truly. The one who prays truly is the theologian, right? So the theologian is not the person who writes many textbooks on theology. That was not the qualification. Theology and prayer are not extricable from each other in that primary and antique sense of theology. How did I recover that insight? Was it by reading Evagrius? Actually, no. It was by reading Hindu and Buddhist traditions in which that bifurcation never got made. It never happened, right? So theology always remains a process of transforming the human being so that the human being can come into a knowing of the divine or ultimate reality. So, there's a way in which it's precisely my journey into other traditions that's brought me back to what theology used to be before it became the kind of reified thing it became in modernity. So I think that's how I would answer your question.
Yeah. What's fascinating, I mean, you mentioned Evagrius and then and then finding him as an ally to something you found in other traditions, right? That way in which theology and prayer are built together. A text I've used in teaching intro was the 5 orations of Nazianzus, because he just basically taunts kids for he's teaching them theology, and then they're getting real confused about something or whatever, and he's like, yeah, well, you haven't even really learned how to pray yet. And it's just you can tell until you know what you're talking about is something you can't talk about because you've prayed long enough to recognize that fact. You should probably be quiet and go pray, then come back and do your homework, right? Obviously he doesn't say it like that. This is Tripp's rendering of what he says in the first 5 orations. But I think that is significant, and that type of vulnerability or kind of helping people focus on the way your own practices shape what will and won't be available to your spiritual and religious imagination is a difficult task when the church and any religious tradition's reflection has accommodated itself to the university. And then you're figuring out, how can I fit this in on a syllabus? Or the same way, a theologian's vocation is a theologian of the church. And yet we do a lot of things that we know the church is not going to benefit from because we also want to hopefully get tenured, right? There's so many ways the logic of the academy has been, is problematic to people's spiritual lives in general. But especially the whole formation thing is you're learning a tradition and it's not built to deal with the wholeness. So then we have to figure out other ways of introducing it. I think that's a real challenge, especially when a lot of students aren't coming to it having deep formation in a community prior. A lot of times,
absolutely,
divinity school or seminaries, the most rich religious community a person will have ever been in.
Yeah, and we certainly ought, therefore, to cultivate a richer vision of what seminaries and even the university can be. One finds notes of this, for example, and I'm just early in this intuition that perhaps the seminary and the divinity school might be the leading edge of transforming the very project of education in Willie Jennings' new book, After Whiteness.
Yeah.
But I'm onto that, an analogous project, because I've come to sort of back up on the whole question of what it means to know anything by encounter with Hindu and Buddhist traditions. And these traditions teach me that, you cannot know what you do not love. And so that the first task is to cultivate a longing for the object of knowledge, which is no object. And that transformative work is the precondition, the qualification, the prerequisite, the requirement for knowing the object. And so love and knowledge are in this complicated dance of transformation. And, that Hindu and Buddhist insight that you practice, then transformation happens, and the transformation makes you suited for knowing the thing that you seek to know. Well, there are plenty of people who are saying that now in the academy. And I'm particularly informed by Pierre Hadot and the work of the late Foucault in places like Care of the Self, and especially in Hermeneutics of the Subject, where, Foucault explicitly says, and he would say prior to Descartes or prior to modernity, it was never assumed that all one had to do to know the truth was to open one's eyes. It's a stunning sentence, right? But that's the modernist assumption, right? If your sensory equipment is working, you can know. But of course, Foucault says that we never thought that. That's a crazy, that's a crazy idea, right? You had to do something, right? There had to be pratique de soi, right? You have to, technologies of the self that fitted the truth, or fitted you for the truth, so that you can know the truth. If Foucault is right, I think we have the beginnings of an understanding of why we live in this peculiar moment where we're in the middle of a fake news crisis. The very possibility of the knowability of reality, forget ultimate reality, but your hand in front of your face, your neighbor, or just what happens to be the news, is because we've entered into an epistemological cul-de-sac in which we don't realize that if we want to know anything, we have to want to know it, and I always, tell my students that I think about that scene in I think it's in A Few Good Men. I may have the movie wrong, where Tom Cruise is, has a Jack Nicholson on the stand, and he, finally pushes him to the breaking point, and Jack Nicholson's character says, "You can't handle the truth," right? From Foucault and analogous studies from Hindu and other traditions, I'm learning most of us don't want the truth. We can't handle the truth because we haven't even cultivated the desire for it by undertaking the practices that sharpen and intensify our longing for the true. And so I think we're in a kind of epistemological, as I said, a cul-de-sac. And so our encounter with other traditions can, I think, revivify a phrase that Wendy Farley uses, our arrows for truth.
I can think of 3 different directions I wanted to go from this point. So one of them is, maybe you could describe explicitly how your kind of vision of comparative work engages secular or humanist traditions. How do you understand or articulate them? Because most of the examples in our conversation and in previous times on the podcast have been kind of conversations across Eastern and Western religions and this type of thing.
It's a searching question. Since I spend most of my daytime engaging in the East-West kinds of work, it requires greater reflection. Part of what I do is to disrupt the very idea of religion, and through the work of Assad and others, interrogate the very constitution of the modern, as reflected in this split between my religious life here and my secular life there. There are all kinds of reasons to say we've never been modern, to borrow a phrase from Latour. If modernity is understood to be captured by that bifurcation, as though it were real and as though we ever observed it. So I'm suspicious that most of the things that we think of as evacuated of the religious, the secular, is actually also forming us in profoundly deep ways. So I argue in the book that the most comprehensive therapeutic regime ever invented was never invented by one of the religions, but is the market, right? The market tutors my desire, not only when I'm awake, but I'm dreaming capitalist dreams as I sleep, right?
Yeah.
And I think of the poor minister who has to preach a 12 to 15 minute sermon in the mainline church and try to say, maybe you should reconfigure your desire. Like the cleric is so outgunned because we're being tutored by advertising, by market mechanisms, by the habits of Facebook. Right? If we are what we desire, a good Augustinian thing to believe, then anything that's tutoring our desire is doing some kind of spiritual work in us. So that's sort of like an axiomatic premise for beginning to answer your question. So then our obligation is to ask ourselves, again, Augustinian, Tillichian question, right? What are my desires? And what's forming those desires? And I want to say that if you ask that question and bring it to, for example, the market, we have toxic formation going on.
Yeah.
But if you spend your time reading, say Butler's new book on nonviolence, which is a profound work, she's engaging in really deep affective work to really try to show us what it means to think nonviolence and interdependence together. So there's a humanist trajectory that works out of a kind of rich Butlerian gender critique tradition. That's a way of forming selves that I find deeply resonant with some of the core work that I've done in reading and practicing Buddhist traditions. So that's the kind of work you have to ask yourself to answer your really brilliant question.
Well, so that actually really connects to the other big direction I was hoping to respond to the last question. So if you look at how religion reworks itself over modernity and into our present context, there's a way in which when philosophers of religion shifted from debating about the rationality of God to then taking the task of interpreting the phenomena of religious life. And then religion kind of is decentered. And so then the philosopher of religion is using the tools of theology to interpret culture in and of itself, right? And so, like, obviously Tillich is a good example of this.
Yeah.
Then, it seems to me that each religious tradition is something we haven't done, right? Like in the comparative work is to see what do other religious traditions do when they play the kind of background ontological work that Christianity does in Tillich at engaging the questions of culture. Like most of the time we do something like the method of correlation or these type of things. It's really shaped by kind of Western Christian notions of anxiety and maybe run through existentialism and these type of things. But I feel like that method of correlation and thinking through a theology of culture in a comparative context really opens up a whole new reservoir of theological reflection that engages multiple religious traditions and secular traditions as stewards of the same mystery.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are people doing this work. I think of David Loy's work on lack. He's essentially doing a Buddhist theology of culture, and bringing Buddhist categories to bear. And one finds in the new book, I forget the author's name, on mindfulness, a kind of Purser, I believe his name is. We find him doing a Buddhist critique of the way in which Buddhism itself is being commodified by culture. So yeah, one can very well imagine comparative theology going beyond sort of loci work and asking, well, if Tillich told us to do a theology of culture, and every cultural realm is fraught with meaning and so has a depth dimension, why only a Christian theology of culture? That's a fantastic question, Trip. And can you imagine a comparative theology of culture in which Christian and Buddhist voices collaborate to say, well, what do you see happening here? I think that's fantastic. I mean, I imagine in the book, and maybe this is why you brought it up, I imagine, for example, I don't say what it would look like, but I imagine the possibility of a comparative theology of usury. What might Muslims and Christians have to say about interest rates, right? Now, that question is not permitted because interest and finance is supposedly secular, and theology is not supposed to think about that. Bonkers, right? Who wants to have such a domesticated theology? So I imagine that comparative theology that is done against religion after the critique of the reified category might well turn to these kinds of projects and so be transformed.
And I think then some of the distinctions that are helpful are really kind of the mode of engagement, right? Like you give the example of Judith Butler's new book on nonviolence. I think that's there's a way that type of engagement can use the surplus of meaning from any religious tradition to get at it, right? Like, and different secular traditions and across them. But it's not performing, in a sense, the therapeutic function in the same way of, as opposed to like it's not accommodating yourself to the dominant religion of the market. Once we recognize how much our own subjectivity is constantly invaded and determined by a system evaluation that's more akin to Pharaoh than to anything Yahweh ever told Pharaoh, then I feel like unless you recognize just how much is getting itself done in culture and think about it theologically, then you're abdicating yourself to the very logic that has now managed to screw the whole planet up and keeps the poor, and then keeps you anxious because you might just become one in the wrong time, right? Like, who right now thinks, wow, this is the best time to be alive, I think I should have more children? Nobody. Like, no one. And yet we can't imagine a world running on some other deep values. And so in some sense, I feel like each religious tradition is a gift because it might actually allow us to become heretics to economism, which is the world's worst global religion. We can only become heretics to economism if religious traditions are empowered to critique culture and engage culture and deconstruct those ideologies and lay bare the way we have comported ourselves to them.
Amen, brother. You preach that gospel. I mean, was it Frederick Jameson who, we quote all the time now, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? That's a haunting mantra that, right? I mean, maybe the unthinkability of capitalism would be less daunting if we were to remember what a variety of traditions teach us, right? that you cannot know the nature of reality until you contest the equipment you bring to bear, the affective equipment you bring to bear to reality, right? So until you interrupt the therapeutic regimes that the market has installed in your body to tutor you into a way of being comported, into making you think of yourself as a consumer and a worker, right? Until that is interrupted by another set of therapeutic regimes, you can't fight an idea that's lodged in a particular therapeutic regime by going directly at the idea. You have to mobilize another set of therapeutic regimes against it if the hold of the idea is to be disrupted. So if we're going to contest capitalism, we're going to have to learn to desire afresh and anew, and in healing ways. And that's why we've got to practice. Here, of course, I'm moving in a direction that's much more open to spiritual disciplines than Protestants typically tend to be, with our sort of paralyzing concern about works righteousness.
Well, or you could say that we decided that the market was the best place to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, right?
Yeah.
Like the Protestant work ethic shows just how good we are at spiritual disciplines. It's a brand new book, but Joseph Henrich's new book on weird society, and
I don't know it.
So Joseph Henrich is brilliant. He's a multidisciplinary thinker, but does like social psychology, cultural evolution, and all these types of things. And he wrote a number of books exploring the expanded synthesis in evolution, right? Like the role at which things operate at the group level and this type of thing. And this new book that just came out, and it's ginormous. So I've heard 2 or 3 interviews with him about it, and then I've read the first 100 of like 800 pages.
Oh my gosh.
But is how Western Christianity became the perfect religion for domination system that took over the world, like analyzed as someone who kind of has hooked together multiple disciplines to think through social evolution. Wow. And it is scary, fascinating. But like when you said that about like we gave up spiritual disciplines, I'm thinking of this book of like, oh, we didn't. We just figured out some of the best disciplines you'd ever heard of. Like you don't even take all the paid vacation days you get. Why? Because you're a hard worker. And you know what Jesus loves? Hard work. There's so many things in it that are like the emergence of purity culture in evolution has to do. It sets up how we spread and conquered places. There's so many different things in it where if you are reading it as a theologian and you're comfortable engaging science, you're sitting there going like, oh no. I feel like a demonologist is just looking at Christendom's inner operating system, and you're like, this isn't good. When if I'm trying to get him to come on the podcast, but in one sense, I want to be like, this book is the best explanation of what Whitehead meant when he said that Caesar's lawyers got a hold of the tradition.
Yeah.
And
yeah. What's the name of the title again?
It's Joseph Henrich, and it's weird. So he wrote an article about how like all this psychology stuff is based on essentially affluent Western college students, because that's who gets tested. Hold on, I'll have to pull it up. Joseph Henrich. The weirdest people in the world, how the West became psychologically peculiar and peculiarly the weirdest people in the world, and I would guess a third of it or so is explicitly about religion, and the rest of it's like how the things we've taught ourselves in religion then get dial up the competition and dominations logic that then the West just goes around walloping everybody. And I'm going to talk about it until I convince enough people to read it, just so I can talk to them about the book. That's my, when you find one of those books.
Yes.
And
All
you're,
800 pages, eh?
well, I'll send you a link to a couple interviews he did about it, because you'll get it.
That
Like,
sounds good.
You can go check the footnotes when you got to point out the demons, but the big story of it is fascinating.
Well, I mean, what you're calling out for is, as you say, a possibility announced in the book that interreligious dialogue, if it isn't constrained by the category
Mm-hmm.
religion, can really do a theology of culture, but an interreligious theology of culture. And in which case, the interlocutors are multiplied considerably. It's not just Christians and Buddhists sitting around a dialogue table, in some conference room, but it's a much more robust and culturally critical enterprise. And I think that's right. I think you're reading some of my intentions, perhaps even more strongly than I've articulated it in the book. So
Well,
thank you.
Well, my experience of reading books once I know somebody is, I'm half reading it and then half imagining myself talking to them about it. And so,
You get to do that.
yeah, then you're like, oh, well, so, one of the things that, thinking about that culture and biological element, and this is like something that came up recently when I was reading Paul Ricoeur's, he is sitting there exploring the role of language and sociality and stuff, but everyone has this kind of like shared biology, and then you have this role of culture. And one of the ways in which he is trying to connect hermeneutics of suspicion and hermeneutics of understanding is that even across difference, in the sense that until you're in a community of enactment, there's a type of understanding that only comes from enacting a particular discourse or whatever, right? Like, if you don't actually pray for your enemy, then you're probably not the one to tell Christians how the eschaton works out, because then you're worried that Gandhi might get in. You're like, well, I don't know, is he going to go to heaven? And then it's like you pray for your enemies long enough and you don't ask that question. So I keep thinking of the possibilities of mutual wisdom in learning from other religious traditions, because our shared cognitive mechanisms that religions are ultimately connected to in some real sense, dealing culturally with big questions like finitude and the three wonders that you talk about in the book. There's so many places that we have deep connections. It's like finding out you can put a whole different program on a computer and do all these other sorts of different things with it. But if all you've ever had is like that one program, and then all of a sudden you can have a different program, like new possibilities pop up. But you don't get to know what's in the other one on the terms of your own program, because for so long they have their own trajectory and evolution and stuff. And yet you do have ability to benefit from it, because we are cultured, embodied biological beings. It's like thinking of that tension between the two is something in how the cognitive science of religion would connect to reflecting on it as I don't know, a possible research question or something that came up when reading it.
No, absolutely. It is in there. And if I were to say, is there something that I wish I had actually sort of read more about, so that the book would have been more nuanced? Is it? I signal it. I name it. It's the relationship between biology and culture, and I point out that some of the reference I use, like Peter Berger, are old, and I point to like early reading in this book on biocultural creatures, and so I'm still at a moment where I need to rethink both sociology of religion and theories of culture that are richer and are attuned to the way in which culture is itself a kind of biological reality, and locate culture more deeply in nature. I mean, some of my work in animal studies points out, among other things, that culture is not just something humans have, right? So there's a sense in which, anything we think we do that they don't, those, the other, more than human animals, it turns out they do it too. So culture too is more intimately tied to biology.
And the elements that are unique for humans have to do with social learning, which is a fascinating thing. Like it's by the collective holding wisdom over time and sharing it through practice and relationships that are beyond the family unit of trust. And you're sitting there going like, yeah, what's really good at doing that? Like religious traditions, that's what they're like on their best days. What do? Relationships of trust for social learning and cultivating habits and practices that make one human much more capable of engaging in the world than they would on their own. And I think that like using disciplines that don't have such a legacy of zero-sum thinking like theology or religion does, to look at what's going on in each tradition if you're analyzing them as kind of genealogies of this particular group's like kind of discoveries of generative habits over time, and then not to like go pillage them, right? Like the Nick mindfulness book, because if you can figure out a way of framing it where in a sense these traditions that are now starting to engage each other in new and robust ways are bringing like genuine wisdom that benefits human flourishing to each other, then
absolutely
that's a different task than, or maybe it's easier. I don't know if it's easier. In my head it is, just because I've had enough experiences where people once you theologically trigger somebody where their demand on behalf of whatever their deity is for sameness goes up, it just can get ugly fast. So I'm always thinking of what's the workaround. How do you sidestep it so that you give them the Trojan horse? And
no, I mean, it's such a curious conundrum, right? If there's anything Christianity should be against, it's zero-sum thinking. The whole logic of the tradition, the whole logic of the cross, the whole logic of Jesus' life is to say that unless your neighbor flourishes, you don't. I mean, that is antithetical in every way possible to zero-sum thinking. And yet, what do Christians do when they're being Christian with respect to other religious traditions? Zero-sum thinking. And so you're naming a fundamental pastoral problem, cultural problem. It's a doozy.
Well, what if we just got Christians to wear more crosses? Then they would be reminded of this.
That would do it, I'm sure.
Yeah, that would be how to do it. So when this book came out, the edited volume on Theology Without Walls came out, there's a growing conversation in the academy around comparative theology. How would you describe the major research questions at this moment, and either other thinkers or conversation partners that for people first connecting to this intellectual conversation to go check out?
I suppose that the question that I'm haunted by is, if everything I've said in this book is true, if I really believe what I've written, what would have to change about my practice?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a daunting question. It's not so much a kind of raw theory question, but it entails theoretical transformation, right? That's why I'm reading these trajectories of thinkers who are talking about philosophy as a way of life, and Foucault's hermeneutics of the subject. I'm mentioning these people because they're already thinking what is entailed by my argument, that you can't know otherwise until you practice otherwise. Right? So who's thinking that? Well, Haddo's philosophy is a way of life. I'm dipping my toes into this new book by Simone Kotva, who's at Cambridge, on effort and grace. Again, examining Simone Weil and Haddo and others. There's this work that's being done in rigorous ways that is asking questions about habit, about disposition, about transformation, and about what would happen to academic life if we actually started talking about all of this stuff and taking it seriously. I mean, in effect, it's attempting to really disrupt a kind of modernist posture in which, as Foucault says, all you have to do to know is to open your eyes. Well, if we no longer think that's credible theoretically, then what do we have to do differently in the body, and what's entailed by that for how we think, how we constitute communities of knowing, how we constitute the university, how we constitute the seminary? All of that, we're at a moment where all of that is, I think, opening up. It's opening up in every field I can think of, and perhaps in some really creative ways in anthropology and ethnography, where the ethnographers are doing what the comparative theologians like me, anyway, are calling for. When people are writing books like How Forests Think, and are trying to understand how indigenous communities think, not merely to say, oh, how curious they are, but actually to say, well, what would happen if I adopted this ontology?
Right.
That's ethnography doing what I am calling for in this book, right?
Yeah.
So I think I think we're on the verge of a number of exciting theological and philosophical and ethnographic trends to rupture certain enlightenment paradigms of knowing.
Oh yeah. Okay. How Forests Think is one of the best books I've read in the last 2 years.
Fantastic.
Like Eduardo Cohn, if people are wanting to go look it up, and that actually set off like the larger book project I'm working on right now is currently called Nature Abridged. And
What a title.
Well, I found this line in Arthur Eddington, who is a physicist, the one that did the experiments, proved Einstein's right. He's also a Quaker evolutionary. He's an evolutionary panentheist Quaker. He did the experiments during the World War, and proving a German right was not popular, and so it was all part of his science should demonstrate the unity of humans against war. So like his Quaker. Anyway, he's a great personal story is great. Well, he is really frustrated by physics. He's obviously a physicist, but of people that think that the appropriate way of relating to the world is bifurcating nature with primary and secondary causes, right? Like, and he has a relationship with Whitehead, and they're all in the room at the same time. Whitehead, and so that Whitehead is chairing the meeting when they announce the results. So I've found just enough history that I think I could pastor exaggerate it into a high quality opening to a book, but in some of his interactions with people around, they're like, why is this Quaker? Why are you talking about religion and all this kind of spirituality? He just said, look, if you say all that matters is matter, and all that matter is are these physical things that have these primary qualities, then what you did was abridge nature and then tell me that you can't ask the questions all humans have been asking. And so his whole thing isn't like, he's just like, you misunderstand. The world's much bigger than what you get at in physics, but that doesn't mean anything negative about what physics is. It's just you bifurcate nature then you call half of it real, and the other half is you know, and the consequences for that are huge. And the How Forests Think book was so helpful to me because, unlike some of my friends that read it and were not thrilled with long excurses on Peirce, I thought it was great. And like looking at how even ghosts and trees have semiotic communication in that whole ontology, and that indexical and iconic semiotics are functioning in all different types of biological life, and at different levels of collective, like a grove or whatever, is shows just how much we've internalized the bifurcation of nature, right? In your example of seeing, when you like, that is sensationalism gone amok.
That's right. That's right.
And it's horrible. Like, it's just bad and wrong, and it needs to go away. And I don't think you can be a Christian if you believe it. That's like a triumphalistic statement of the day, is like bifurcation of nature ruins religion, and then it ruins humanity, and it's probably the leading cause of death on the planet. That's the
you are a true inheritor of John Cobb, whose beef on seeing is legendary.
Oh yeah. He doesn't, not a big fan of just seeing things.
Yeah, and maybe that's perhaps that's one of the things I'm doing by foregrounding touch as
well, because his response is to look at hearing and yours is to look at touch. And I actually thought, anyway, so there's one other tangentially related question, especially after you brought up the Eduardo Kohn. Has anyone, or how would it be possible to look at how the arrival in different cultures and traditions of kind of market capitalism and logic of the international order impacts different religious traditions and their own self-understanding? Because I kept thinking, like, when you look at, in some sense, if we did a comparative analysis of how these impacted different religious traditions upon the first couple generations and then so many generations out, you could get data on a lot of different things. You could look at different texts from the religious traditions. You could look at things we could keep data on over time and stuff. But I feel like there should be some way of going, like, this is what happens when this type of, when your Monday through Friday liturgy is determined by mammon, here's what the wisdom traditions decide to start editing out,
Yeah.
And what do they get silent on? And I feel like that could be a real life, like you could have wonderful interreligious engagement over that type of data and presentation.
Oh no, I think it's a fascinating research project. My first thought was only that capitalism never arrives alone, and often may not even be the primary factor. It's its mode of arrival through colonial or imperial projects, right? So it's impossible to disentangle the arrival of colonialism from the capitalism from the arrival of colonialism. So it's the imperial project and its violence that is almost a kind of overriding phenomena, or at least impossible to disentangle from global capitalism. And of course, capitalism mutates, and so does modes of controlling power. Those two also take new configurations. But if I look at what's happening globally across religious traditions, is the way, what seems to me deeply unfortunate is what happens when religious traditions try to resist the arrogance of imperial formation and colonization, when it tries to be, when it tries to resist, but tries to resist in the mode of the oppressor, rather than the best post-colonial or decolonial work in which the very logic of oppression is called into question. When that doesn't happen, when cultural forces mimic the oppressor, oh Lord, religious traditions become identitarian projects. And, and so we have the rise of these behemoths like, the Hindu right with Hindutva, Buddhist nationalisms. In these postures, these religious traditions actually have, if anything, abandoned their own therapeutic regimes and have embraced identitarian projects that seem to mimic the oppressor, but to stick it to them. And the result is not good, because you actually just end up repeating oppression. And I think this was what Gandhi was trying to sabotage by saying, look, we don't want English rule without the Englishman. That's not what we want. So that was a kind of early recognition by a radically anti-imperial thinker to say, we won't succeed on these terms. And so, interestingly enough, one finds in Mohandas a radical attention to practices, ashram practices, observances, hymn singing, fasting, right? That there's a kind of sense that unless the affective work of shaping desire reconfigures the very understanding of what it means to be a self in a contra-imperial posture, the self is not actually going to have the emancipatory capacities it needs to resist.
Yeah.
It will become too deeply formed by an alien logic, which will just lead to repetition rather than refusal.
It strikes me that how gifted Christians are at not cultivating practices, and when Jesus teaches about them, he doesn't suggest them. He just says, when you fast, when you pray, when you give, when you love. And, and the assumption is, well, there's no way you could really be my disciple without doing these things. Like there's assumption that these practices are actually necessary to cultivate the form of life that you're being called into. And that spiritual practices are kind of electives for your religious identity is how you get people who use a religious identity and then go, you just kind of shake your head. You're like, I don't remember the exact number, but a very significant number of white evangelicals who love Trump have not been to a worship service in years. And you're just like, well, that's interesting. What does that word even mean at this point? I don't think it's because they have such intense quiet times reading the Bible every day that they're just like, I don't even need to go sing. It's that kind of removing the habits out of the faith and then locating how you identify with it as a decision one makes cognitively is rather problematic.
Oh yeah, all you have to do is cite the old verse, right? Unless you confess with your lips and believe in your heart that Jesus Christ is done, right? I do those two things. I confess with my lips and supposedly believe in my heart. So it becomes a kind of notional cognitive thing. And finito, done, that's it. Interestingly enough, one of the arguments that one finds in some anthropological work, for example, in Sri Lanka, and in the work of people like Gananath Obisekere, is that Buddhism has become Protestantized. That part of what happens in the arrival of Buddhist nationalism is that Henry Steele Olcott and others established Buddhist catechisms, so that being Buddhist looks like certain notional forms of being Christian. And what gets lost in Protestant Buddhism is among other things, the repertoires of self-formation, the vast treasuries of ethical lore found in myth and in narrative. All that gets lost as irrationalism, and a certain kind of confessionalism takes over. And that's, of course, very convenient if, along with colonialism, you want to impose market capitalism. It's not good. It's not good.
I heard a lecture from one of the previous head of development for the World Bank when they were speaking at the business school at Claremont, and in the Q&A they were going back and forth, and he talked about faith partnerships, and I'm like, oh God, this is going to be interesting. Well, he gives an aside about, he goes, he's giving this as an example of thinking in econometrics, that you don't just think about the economic parts, you have to think about the different cultural levers you have to turn on, right, culturally, the things that function for, cultivating independence in a nation, which really means cultivating enough debt and the ability to service your debt internationally. But he goes, yeah, so like we had a lot of trouble in Haiti because their indigenous religions don't work really well with market thinking. So we developed a lot of partnerships with Reformed missionaries because they have the best success rate at cultivating people who, essentially can cooperate with the system of the international market expectations. And I'm just sitting there, I was like, did you just say that you find missionaries with certain religious beliefs to come because if they're successful, they will more deeply cooperate with the World Bank? And he's like, yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I'm just like, it is. And, yeah, anyway, I don't have to get set off again on a sermon, but it is there's a collection of spaces in our lives where the fact that they aren't on our cognitive menu, we never decide whether to admit other agents determining our agency.
Yeah, and that's why I think this book insists on not just interpretive schemes, but therapeutic regimes, right?
Yeah.
That how we shape what it means to be religious and form religious dispositions is not just cooking up interpretive schemes, ways to read the world. Those are important. But most of the traditions that I study are insistent that the interpretive schemes don't actually work until they're installed in the body by means of the practice of therapeutic regimes, so you can see as they command you to see. So, no therapeutic regimes, no transformation. No transformation, no seeing, no knowing, no living otherwise. So if you want to do a comparative theology that is in no way attentive to therapeutic regimes, I don't know what you're doing, right? It in no way mirrors the traditions that you are trying to study. So one of the axes I'm grinding in the Theology Without Walls chapter and in current writing is to say, if Christian theology has conformed itself to university modes of knowing, right, and theology becomes a kind of academic discipline, but theology in Hinduism and Buddhism remains a practice, a practice-infused transformation of self, then when Christian theology as academic discipline meets Buddhist and Hindu enterprises in theologizing, they're never going to meet, right? So that's partly why going back to Evagrius, as I mentioned earlier, makes sense, because Evagrius and forms of theology that keep prayer and reflection, therapeutic regimes and interpretive schemes together can recognize what Hindu and Buddhist traditions are about in ways that, the academic text production right? That's not theology. That's never going to be recognized as the primary mode of what theology looks like for Hindus and Buddhists. Now, of course, I want Hindus and Buddhists to be able to make their way into the academy, but not if they have to conform to what I take to be a problematic and limited conception of what knowing is that we need to overcome. So let's let the Hindus and Buddhists transfigure the academic game itself, so that we move to something truly postmodern or perhaps even post-secular, but in a interreligious sense rather than in a kind of erasure of the other sense.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I've had tons of fun talking with you.
Yeah.
And we've gone all over the place in this conversation. So, yes.
I wonder what our listeners will make of this.
Well,
so.
You haven't heard how it gets edited yet, you know?
That's true.
Yeah. But no, it's been tons of fun. If you are recent to finding the podcast, you just go to the blog post and you'll find links to the other times John's been on the podcast. You can find out more about his work. Then you can listen to it, see how it developed, links to the books and all that kind of stuff. And he's at Union Theological Seminary in New York. So if you're considering theological education and want to get to hang out with John, post-COVID in New York, then check it out.
Well, thanks, Trip. Great fun as always. Right.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this episode of Homebrewed Christianity. If you're here, it's because you're a super nerd. It's because you enjoyed this conversation. Then have I got news for you. You should join the Homebrewed community. That's right. Go to homebrewedcommunity.com and you can be a part of the community that makes this possible. You'll get access to a members-only Facebook group, a members-only podcast feed with tons of extra material, and you can go to bed at night knowing that I am one of the elect, the people that make this podcast possible. That's right. And guess what? When you join, you get your own ecclesiastical title. You could be an acolyte, a deacon, an elder, a bishop. Yes, that's right. It all happens at homebrewedcommunity.com. Thank you so much for listening.